Welcome to another in a series of conversations with leaders. My name is Mike Desjardins, and I'm the CEO at Virtus. Today, I'm here as an individual, speaking from my own journey and my own perspective, not that of my company and my career. And I'm here with my friend, Yabome Gilpin-Jackson. And Yabome, I'll let you introduce yourself.
Thank you so much, Mike. Always a pleasure to be in conversation with you. And thank you for having me back in these conversations. My name is Yabome Gilpin-Jackson, and it's a pleasure to be talking to any of you that are listening or have you listen in on our conversation. I am joining today as a person in the world, really, that really deeply cares about the work that we do in organizations around justice, equity, diversity, inclusion, and all the different labels we're putting on this work of being better human beings in the world, and care about how we enact that in organizations and in the world around us. I identify as an organization development practitioner and scholar. I do this work in my day job in the BC public sector in a chief people officer role at BCLC. I do it in my consulting and private life and in my teaching and speaking. So happy to be here on these traditional, unceded, and ancestral territories of the Tk'emlúps te Secwépemc peoples here in the place in British Columbia that we in colonial terms call Kamloops, a place that has had a lot of reckoning in itself in recent times. So.
And I'll also share, from colonial terms, I am on what is now called Galiano Island, but I'd like to acknowledge that I'm currently standing on the shared, asserted, and unceded territories of Lamulcha, Penelakut, Haltzium First Nations, and other Halkamatum speaking people, Sinkatin and Wisconsin speaking peoples, and any others that have rights and responsibilities around what is now called Galiano Island. And I'd also like to acknowledge that this is the ceded territory of the Tsawwassen First Nation.
Yeah.
And interestingly, just to kind of dive into the conversation, I mean, one island away is the Penelakut First Nation territory, which is where the Cupper Island Indian Residential School, where bodies were found last month, actually, which is part of the conversation that we're having today. Our last conversation, which you can check out on this podcast, just over a year ago. And that conversation was really around my desire to learn how to be a better ally after the work that we were doing as an organization, but also my own personal work around white supremacy and white privilege, particularly having read the book White Supremacy by Layla Saad. And I reached out to Yabome and said, as a Black person, I don't have any desire for you to teach me or others how not to be racist. That's not your job. But I also know that you're very articulate, both in your writing and in your videos. And I had read quite a number of things that you'd posted on your personal blog. And I said, I want, as an ally, I would like to magnify and amplify that message and push it out to the leaders that I have access to through all the organizations that we work with across Canada to the US. And you're very gracious to take the time to have that conversation and share, as a Black woman, as a human being, as a leader in the community, what your experience was, what you're seeing, where you were at in your journey, and just what you were witnessing in the world. And this conversation really came as the news cycle, as it does, COVID hit. And then we're sitting here within August of 2021, and we have variants of COVID, multiple variants of COVID. We have a potential for a federal election to be called tomorrow. We have the news cycle in the US and everything that's going on there. We have the US pulling out of Afghanistan and all the things that are happening there. And my concern is that the conversation around Black Lives Matter, around supporting the BIPOC community, and as you said in our last chat, the rise in anti-Asian hate that has occurred in the past 6 months in particular, and then as well is the Indigenous rights and everything that has happened with an understanding about residential schools and what's happened since the Truth and Reconciliation Commission that brings us current to today. And so it's a big, I feel like that's a big conversation. And I think I know I'll speak for myself, and I'll let you speak for yourself, Yabome. I am not coming to this as a proxy for any of the
Absolutely.
communities that I just referenced. I'm not coming as an expert by any stretch of the imagination. I am an interested, curious human being, and I want to continue to educate myself. And part of how I do that is through conversation. And I had a wonderful conversation this morning to help me understand the land that I'm currently standing on and the lands that are around me. You can see Main Island, the Colonial main Island in the background, and this is active past here as well. So I think just to be very, very clear, that's the perspective I will speak from today. And Yabome, I'll let you share the perspective that you'd like to speak from today.
Yeah, very similar. Likewise, I definitely do not represent all of the diversities in the Black community or all of the experience that Black women tend to have in the world, but I represent part of that community. And so just speak from, as I will always say, from my lived experiences. And as in my scholarship, I identify as an applied social sciences. So to the extent that, many people in this field have talked about, to the extent that troubles personally felt can be put in the public eye, that is scholarship and research in itself, and a way to access research questions and a way to access deeper understanding that we often miss when we just look at aggregated broad data sets and don't disaggregate and don't look at the outliers and don't understand experience. So I am stepping into this conversation always from a lifelong learner perspective, someone that's interested in using my own personal to understand social phenomena and use that to advance my scholarship and my research. So that's who I am in this conversation. And can I say, I just love how for Indigenous friends and colleagues, if you're listening to us, and if we had all muddled any of the names of these traditional and ancestral territories, just to note that and ask for your grace. I am loving how all of us that are interested in stepping into this conversation are having to learn the names of the territories and places where we've been living for a long time, often unconscious. For me, starting to dig deeper and trying to understand a bit more the meanings behind the names. I come from an Indigenous culture where meanings matter as well. And just a call out both for Grace, for my Indigenous relations, and for everyone else to, it's messy and we're all muddling our way through. The only way to do this work is to do it. Even when it's uncomfortable and messy. And I'm not sure if we actually muddled any pronunciation.
Oh, I'm sure. I'm sure I did. I've been working on this all morning to try to get it right, and I'm sure I didn't do it
and I'm
justice.
Not always
but
sure
I
as well.
Want to know that the spirit of and the intent behind it is to have a recognition of the territories that each of us are standing on right now and are speaking from. And so I appreciate you asking for grace in that regard. As you sit back and to further the conversation around the Truth and Reconciliation Commission and what we're discovering and continue to discover around the Canadian residential school. Chad was sharing with me this morning a couple of facts. One, that the residential schools, the last one closed in 1996, and that there are still boiled water advisories in place for Indigenous populations that have been in place for 30 years. The other fact he shared with me is that you had a better chance of surviving World War II as a Canadian soldier than you did of surviving a residential school in Canada if you were from the Indigenous population. And that's an astounding statistic. We're also sitting currently where I'm standing in the Salish Sea. This had the highest population density of Indigenous lands in the world. And the actual population that was here has actually been vastly underestimated in the past by colonists. And there were some very good reasons why, self-serving reasons why that was done. So I wanted to lay that piece for the Indigenous piece of the conversation, just to give people background. If you haven't had a chance to learn more about this particular topic, I think Yabome shared with me a wonderful podcast Judge Murray Sinclair did with CBC. I'll put it in the show notes, actually. You can just click on it. I think it is a wonderful job of describing the history, what happened with Truth and Reconciliation Commission, what happened after that, what's happening with residential schools and the discoveries of the graves, the numbers that you hear when graves are brought up is not the numbers. Those are not the numbers.
Absolutely.
I'm curious. I wanted to just lay a bit of that foundation for us in this conversation, because I'm quite curious. When you sit back in the quiet times and you reflect about what's happening, what do you wish that somebody who read a story in the newspaper or listened to something briefly on the radio and said, oh, I kind of understand what's going on. What do you wish that they actually knew?
That's a great question. I think for me, so as we go through this conversation, I'm going to use anti-oppression broadly to speak about social injustices of all kinds, and then I'll be specific to the different forums. As you listed them earlier, there's a lot of different ways to think about these issues, and we know that the specificity is important so that people don't collapse everything, which is going to be part of my answer. Don't collapse everything, and therefore in the process of having everything together sort of abdicate the responsibility of understanding specific contexts and understanding specific changes and solutions and new ways of being that are needed in all the different contexts of oppression and social marginalization that again, as I said in the last podcast, that we have created as human beings. We have created the societies that we're in, we've designed them, and they're operating perfectly in the way that they were designed. And the work going on all over the world right now is, as the term that's being used, is to decolonize the social systems and structures that we've created so that it works for all and not only for some segments of the world, right? And so what I would wish for as we hear the news, I'm going to stick with our Indigenous context and the question of reconciliation as the term that we're using to understand that all of us that are settlers, including myself as an immigrant to the lands we called Canada, in spite of the rest of my social identity, I have come and settled on lands that were colonized and came into a context that probably that made that possible on the atrocities of this place. And so my wish is that we will all not essentialize and generalize the issues, that we will take the time through self-study, through opportunities in our organizations, through the opportunities you mentioned, your friend that's a professor, through our institutions, through our libraries, Google it for crying it out loud,
right?
Through and make sense of what is credible media to consume. My wish is that we will stay on this journey of understanding before knee-jerking to any kind of answers, solutions, responses. And so twofold, and that we would also, once we have taken that pause and a measured approach to understand what's before us, that we will each, no matter where we are, who we are, where we find ourselves, that we will each choose, make that conscious choice to do something, anything. Many people when I speak, I often talk about the power of putting action behind intention, no matter how small. I think often in the space of these conversations about anti-oppression that I'm a part of, often people go, but it's overwhelming. How? How is taking that first one small step? This is, I'm not going to go a lot into my background. I want us to stay in the conversation. But I often talk about really, for me, hitting those points of realization. That point I described the last time we spoke, when my children started coming home, asking me questions about their identity, prompted by strangers and people at school, asking them questions about their identity that they were confused about, because in their minds, at their young ages, they were Canadians living life like every other Canadian. I can specifically to actions, small things that I took on as a result of all of those encounters. One small thing that led to another thing, that led to writing a paper, that led to a conference talk, that led to um, all these ripple effects that have allowed me to be in conversations like the one we're having, Mike, and
Mm-hmm.
others, or be on these panels and conference platforms and done this doctorate. I was very clear that I wanted to stay in practice as an organization development leader, scholar, practitioner. I was very clear. My time has not yet come to go, for example, fully into academia. That's a question people will often ask me because I love being in practice. I love engaging with leaders. I love doing the work that's needed to create thriving workplaces, group spaces. I love that. And I want to keep doing it alongside thought leadership. Point that I decided, okay, and I want to at least, what I'm going to do is at least work on writing and publishing one thing a year, one scholarly
Mm-hmm.
piece a year. And I remember that first paper that I tried to publish. I remember the rejections. I remember,
Right.
shopping it around the journals and getting no
Right.
after no, or getting such overwhelming peer reviewed feedback that I was like, oh, okay, maybe I can't do this. and yet, and yet thinking that it was important because part of why it felt so important to me was my lived experiences and the
Mm-hmm.
questions I was wrestling with were not in the literatures, were not in the journals, not across the board. I'm sure there was
Mm-hmm.
some in different places. I'm not claiming that I have, uniquely created space for some of the experiences that I have that are shared. But in the ways and in the literature and in the spaces that I was encountering, I wasn't seeing it. And so I persevered through that
Mm-hmm.
until I got that one publication. And then that led to another one. And that led to,
Mm-hmm.
someone else saying, hey, you want to co-write this thing with me? And it sort of opens the possibilities. And so my encouragement across the board is take the pause, take the
Mm-hmm.
time to understand, and then choose your
Mm-hmm.
unique contribution. Choose the
Mm-hmm.
one thing, the small thing that you can do in your family, in your workplace, in your community. Do it and trust that in doing that from the right intention, that you're going to meet other people that care about the same things. And
This is
don't
an
try to be a
example,
lone
right?
hero.
Well, this is we're living that example
Yes.
that you're describing right now. I mean,
Yeah.
neither of us is declaring ourselves as an expert in this space. It could be considered risky for you and I to have this conversation. I'm a 49-year-old white man. I'm the problem in the world, right? So, or I would be stereotypically referred to as a problem in the world. And so,
Thank you for
uh,
qualifying that.
yeah, and
Yes.
and then not to get myself off the hook by any stretch,
Yes.
but so I think just there's either I've heard a wonderful quote, and I unfortunately can't attribute it, but the quote was, "Trying is doing."
Yes.
And so if they're thinking about, well, I don't want to screw up, or I don't, what if I don't get it right, or
Yes.
what if I'm
Yeah.
perceived as ignorant, or what if I'm called out,
Yes.
or what if I'm called in,
Yes.
right? And so I think it's easy to say there's lots of reasons why I wouldn't do it. I was on a call and someone was describing the various terms they were hearing today. You
Mm-hmm.
mentioned decolonization as an example of places and names, and understanding where we all stand and live as one example. And the person was mentioning, well, there's all these terms, whether it's diversity or equity or inclusion or anti-racism. And she listed a whole bunch of things and said, I don't like, I'm not sure where to start. I don't do anything. And my
Mm-hmm.
response was to that, because it was posed as kind of a question about where do you even get started. And I said, well, I would start with just understanding what those words mean.
Yeah.
So if you hear a word and you say, like, I don't understand what that word means, as you say, if only we had access to worldwide information at our fingertips, right? Google search it and
Yeah.
get an answer, because you may find, I know for me, by doing the work and educating myself, it led me down the path, because I was trying to find information from trusted sources, and one of those trusted sources ended up being you. Now, you and I knew each other, and we our companies work together, and so we have history in
Yeah.
that way, but that's not why.
Yeah. Yes.
I read what you wrote, and I wouldn't have read. I might not have read that, or I definitely would have read it. I probably wouldn't have read it in the lens. I would have read it more of the lens of, oh, you're articulate and well spoken, and you've really thought about this a lot. And then I would have stopped. But I was on a
Mm,
path, and so
mhm,
reading it
mhm.
inspired me to think, oh, well, what's next? And I think that your point is, um, let's not shoot for perfection. Just try, start, and do something. And maybe something, if you're listening right now, maybe something is just, hey, I heard a couple of terms that Yabome mentioned or that Mike mentioned, and I'm unclear about what those terms mean. Is that one of your children behind you?
Yes.
That's so
Here comes the
wonderful.
child. It's wonderful. COVID times. I thought I locked
Yeah,
the door. I didn't.
no, and you know what? It's so funny because I the number of calls that I'm on where somebody's apologizing for their dog, their cat, their children,
Yes.
their spouse, their partner
No
coming in and out of the
apology.
room. I'm like, the entire globe is
Yes.
living this
That's
experience.
that's
So
right.
nobody ever needs to apologize for any noise, person, animal, object, whatever happens in the background is just the current situation we're all living in. It's just
Yes.
part of our lives. So yeah. So anyway, I wanted to call it out just because I can see somebody hiding behind you there. That's adorable.
That's right. That's right.
And we have children the same age. So
Yes,
yeah. So
exactly.
I think that so I appreciate you sharing your context and where you're thinking right now,
Yeah.
and what you're thinking about. Because we're on or we started in the topic of indigenous from an indigenous lens perspective. I'd love to talk about Canada Day because Canada Day did not feel good this year for the first time in 49 years. I mean, I probably don't remember the younger years, but in my adult years, I can say that I've always looked forward to Canada Day. I saw it as a celebration of who we are as Canadians. I'm very proud to be called a Canadian when I travel the world. And I identify with that, but it just felt different. It felt
Hmm.
different this year
Hmm.
because all of a sudden I felt like, oh, we're celebrating when a bunch of people showed up and decided to rename a place that already had names and
Hmm.
started renaming everything
Yeah.
with names that fit for Europe because they felt comfortable, that were the last names of people that happened to be driving the boat. And that ended up wiping out, 100,000 years of Indigenous history, or attempting to, including trying to attach property rights in a colonial way that really was not how the land was honored and appreciated, and territory was respected here in North America. That is not, and even saying North America, but this land was not experienced in that way before
Hmm.
colonial settlers came here. So I'm curious for you, what was Canada Day? Did Canada Day feel different to you? And if it did, what are the thoughts, the feelings, and emotions that came up for you?
Hmm. Hmm. Wow. What we call Canada Day was really hard for me this year. In the context of what we've been talking about, I live 10, 15 minutes from the Kamloops Residential School, where the 215, again, as you've qualified, those are the public numbers or the numbers that are available. There's more context to understand around all of it, in all the historical complexities. But I live really close to that, and that happened not long before Canada Day. And so between that and I'll tell you the other thing, I was also feeling a lot of well, you asked how I was feeling, a lot of things. I was feeling the heaviness of grief as a parent. I was feeling like unable to imagine, and in fact, doing what our human brains do in terms of blocking out some of that felt pain of trying to imagine what that must have been like for families and the children that were going through the violence that they were going through. I was feeling that. I was also feeling often people with generational atrocities in their history, that impact of the affinity of being a Black person,
Mm-hmm.
um, in our social constructions, and thinking about the parallel atrocities that Black peoples experienced in these North Americas, as you said earlier, and those impacts as well. So really in a really embodied, almost physical way, I sometimes had to distance myself from the need for coming back because those parallels were very present for me. And then another thing about that was, I would say, feeling hurt in response to some callous comment, and that's my word, in terms of how they impacted and landed for me, that I had heard being thrown around. And I'll say specifically what that is. Because when you and I reconnected about, hey, should we do a follow up to the podcast? We talked about, or the last conversation, I realize we're on video. We talked about with all the news cycle and as eras change, and this is what something many people have been saying, and I have also said, it's going to be easy for people to get past the moment of their awareness of Black Lives Matter last year, which of course that was a movement that was always here, both in the formal movement and the community movement and all the ways in which people have been doing that work. Part of our context was that, yeah, people will have moved on from that. And we talked about naming this conversation Black Lives Still Matters.
Still matter.
And then we talked
exactly.
about the context of Canada Day and the Indigenous reality we're living, and wanted to center that conversation as well. I bring that up because a lot of what I was hearing thrown around was, well, in Canada, the most important work is reconciliation. We need to prioritize the Indigenous conversation. We don't need to worry about, the anti-Black racism conversation. That's a US thing. We just need to prioritize Indigenous reconciliation in Canada. I was carrying that deep hurt leading up to Canada Day because I had heard that comment thrown around more than once. Because for me, that is the classic example of anti-Black racism, and why people that are working for social justice and in the anti-oppression spaces have been asking specifically that we name rather than essentialize all the different groups, equity deserving, dignity deserving, like every other human being, groups that have been oppressed and marginalized historically and in the present. And for me, this was, and also the kinds of people in power positions that were saying this, for me, just said that here we are very quickly dismissing and returning to the constructs that continue to fuel anti-Black racism, and to continue to deny that Canada was and still has a part in the historical and the present anti-Black racism issues that are very alive. Even this year in Canada, there are Black families that are grieving losing children because they called for help in mental health crises. And the next thing you know, their children had died as a result of encounters with authorities that are supposed to protect them. I'm moving away as much as we lean into saying names. I'm also leaning into, I want to keep this conversation. Let's talk about the social phenomena. And that's why I appreciated earlier when you said, you sort of qualified your social identity and the way that you might be located as a white male of an age group, middle age and beyond, that socially have been power holders. And I want to acknowledge that a lot of the work I do is also encouraging people, and we all have choices. We can locate ourselves in being part of the solution forward. So I appreciated you making that distinction between social identity and social power and personal power, which is kind of what you did. So I just want to underscore here that let's be very careful as we tread forward. I know we started this conversation around Canada Day, and this was my flag, this Canada Day, this was my background for the Canada Day week and beyond, to acknowledge the Indigenous context and reality and conversations we were having. And I was also grieving the language that I was hearing that was reinforcing anti-Black racism in the mix. I also want to say, before I give it back to you, I know my Indigenous colleagues and friends, the ones I know and the ones that I don't know in the Indigenous community, do not condone that language or that thinking. Our Canadian Indigenous peoples uphold all my relations. And having done direct work with Indigenous colleagues around even conversations in the Vancouver area around anti-racism and anti-oppression, I have worked closely with that community in the conversation of we all collectively need to work both for reconciliation, reparations, restoration of dignity for our individual communities, and collectively as peoples that have experienced historical and current oppressions and marginalization. So I don't think this is something that Indigenous peoples condone or think that anti-Black racism should be put on the side while we advance the reconciliation agenda. And anyone that cares for these issues understands that as long as one of us is hurting, all of us are hurting. And we need to address these issues all together, collectively, and with the same fervor that we put towards social justice and change for everyone. This is not even leaving behind those who have been in power structures. That is not what this is about, because often that's the counter argument I hear. This is rebalancing the inequities in the world because it serves all of us into the future. I know. I'll stop there.
It's
just a small rant.
So I'm
just
trying
a small rant.
I'm trying to keep track of my thought process while listening to you, because you brought up so many valuable points. I think I'm going to go backwards because that might be easier. So anti-racism. I think I just want to speak to anti-racism first. That not being racist, we spoke about this in the other podcast that we did, that not being racist is not the same thing as anti-racism. And the responsibility that we have in all circumstances of racism is to understand how the racism occurred in the first place, understand how I may have been complicit in it, unknowingly or knowingly, own that, and then understand what are the actions I can take to be anti-racist. So saying I'm not racist, I don't say racist things anymore, or I don't currently, is not good enough. We need to take action to do things that are helping to end racism, and that is racism against Indigenous people, it is racism against Black people, it is racism against Asian people, any group that is
color,
racially profiled, people of color, anyone that is that has been oppressed in some way where racism has been used to demean, to diminish, to disparage, to create a lack of equity, and to reduce a person's humanity. And I think, the analogy that popped into my mind, and I'm a big fan of analogies, I know they don't work for everyone, but the analogy that pops into my mind is that if I was driving down the street and I witnessed a car accident, I didn't cause the car accident, but I'm going to stop and I'm going to go find out if everybody's okay. And if they're not okay, then I'm going to do whatever I can to try to help them. And so the argument that, well, I didn't cause any of this harm that happened in the past, but I'm aware of it, there is always an action you can take. And I think the response of, I'm not sure what I can do, is always the easy way out, right? Well, I'm not sure what I can do. I've been like, well, educate myself first. I think that for me has been the key. Has been, I need to educate myself and talk to people who are more knowledgeable than I am so that I understand a deeper sense of the issue. I think Murray Sinclair in the podcast, what really stuck with me in his words is, if I don't understand the intergenerational trauma that is present in a person's life today. So I'll give you an example. There are people that survived residential schools who are alive today. And they have trauma from the loss of the people they cared about, from being ripped away from their family, but from the death that was around them and from what was applied to them. But there are also second generation and third generation, because the residential schools go back so far, so their grandparents or their parents were in residential schools. But what Murray Sinclair talks about is if you don't understand the residential schools from what happened to our Indigenous population in a trauma-focused lens, if you don't understand it from an intergenerational trauma perspective, then it will be very difficult to empathize and be a party to the conversation. So I wanted to just bring that up from that podcast. And then I think your comment about Black Lives Matter and that we were going to call this, originally we were going to call this Black Lives Still Matter. And then we said, but wait, residential schools, truth and reconciliation, anti-Asian hate, like these things are going on.
In the context where we live. Yeah.
Yeah. And so it's got to be part of the conversation. But from a Black Lives Matter perspective, my biggest concern was, do Black Lives matter when another named Black person is murdered and it hits the news? Is that when Black Lives matter?
Yes.
Because
yes.
that's what happens with a news cycle. And I think continuing to have what for many people, I think, and even myself, can feel like an uncomfortable conversation because of a feeling of risk, because of a feeling of a lack of knowledge, because of a feeling of saying the wrong thing. But continuing to have these conversations and to continue to keep it top of mind, because we are not done. And if you're from a Black Lives Matter perspective, I think, and please correct me if you feel there's a better resource, but I think the New York Times 1619 project has done a solid job of explaining the history from 500 years ago or 400 and something years ago, I should say, to today, of what occurred and why are we having the conversation about racism and Black Lives Matter? Like there's 400 years of history,
of evidence, yes,
right, of evidence. Just same thing
yes.
with the indigenous population and what goes back to the original colonial settlers here in what is now called North America. And I think just educating and understanding it, because when my daughter was asking me this afternoon, she says, "Oh, I know you're talking to your friend this afternoon," and I said, "Yeah, I'm doing a podcast." And she said, "You've been working on the land acknowledgement. Is that what you're doing?" And I said, "Yeah, I'm trying not to mess up the names of the different indigenous peoples and languages, land acknowledgement." And she's well aware of what a land acknowledgement
yes.
is. She said, "Well, why are you having this conversation?" So I gave her the background of the conversation, and she is, so much more educated than I was as an adult, and she's 9. And
yes.
right, there is this learning that we've had many conversations about residential schools in the car where she's heard something, or she's heard Sabrina and I talking about it, and then she's like, "Well, what happened? Explain it to me." And we've walked her through it, and she's like, "That's wrong. Like, why are we just learning about this?" And I'm like, "That's the thing. That's the problem, is that we're still in, I feel like we're still trapped in that. We're still learning about it. That speaks nothing towards what we need to do for society."
I want to pick up a few threads and bridge a few things that you were saying. I'll start right there with where you ended with education and that distinct difference between your experience and your daughter's experience. And then I was thinking of my daughter saying this Black History Month, "Oh, Mom, please tell me they're not just going to do some quick assembly. Oh, so it's Black History Month, blah, blah, blah." And then that's
right.
it.
Yeah.
And I was thinking of my experience, and as you were talking, I did elementary and secondary school in the country where my parents are from and where I identify as well as Sierra Leonean. And in Sierra Leone, I went through the British educational system, and I'm listening to you and going, and then there was me growing up in an independent African country, also learning European history.
Right. Very, like, I'm sure you could talk all about World War I and World War II, right?
And having to self-educate, and in fact, having to leave that context and come back out to the West to even realize how colonial my education was. I didn't even realize because I was just absorbing it. So, right? So
how would we know any different as a child? I mean, in school, you're like, this is history, so learn it, and then we'll test you on it. And then you're just left to think that's everything you need to know. That's the whole thing.
So the reminder for everyone that, Indigenous, Black, and people of color, we are not exempt from having been colonized in our mindset. And so when words like decolonizing our systems and our structures and our thinking are put out there, just for the collective that often thinks, "Oh, that's for some people, not for," it's for all of us. Like, this is the work of being better humans going forward into the future and creating systems for our generations that heals where we have hurt and wounded each other, and that creates a world that works across the board. That's what this is about. So I wanted to pick up that thread. I also wanted to bridge the context of anti-racism that we're talking about, and action, those three things, because I think perhaps it might be overwhelming for people to be listening and going, well, I'm supposed to figure out what action I can take, however small, but there's so much. And if I dismiss anti-Black racism and take on something else, then maybe that's problematic in the way I described. I want to be clear, specifically the thinking that resolving anti-Black racism can wait, or that we can prioritize one over the other. That's racist thinking. And
we've been waiting
saying
400 years. So
correct. We've been waiting 400 years. Projects like 1619 Project, phenomenal. And there's so many resources out there right now. And remember also that even in our context, August 1st was the first time we recognized Emancipation Day in Canada, which is the official day that enslaved people were freed in British North America and in the Caribbean, etc. August 1st this year is the first time that was recognized. After slavery was abolished, etc., slave owners were paid for losing property. Black loyalists and freed Black peoples that were promised land were not given their land, not been repaid in any way for the impact. Nothing will compensate for the intergenerational traumas, nothing. But even on that surface level, that is still has never been resolved. And so the idea that, oh, this can wait, let's just prioritize this, that's the issue. Now, that doesn't mean that you as an individual can't choose to be an ally in one space or the other. It all, you're open and listening and supporting. I am not actively participating in all the spaces and movements for anti-oppression, right? I am not, because we are all one person, or we're connected to a group that's passionate about one thing or the other. So that's okay. This is not to say that you have to actively be in action on all of these things. That's exhausting and depleting for any one person. The reality, though, is that you can create an anti-oppressive, anti-racist mindset across the board, and know that even your words and action, your words are part of the action to change narratives and to change thinking. So that when you hear something like, let's not worry about that in Canada, it's not so much of an issue, you are educated enough to pause that and say something, even if you're not in action, say in the Black community or actively. So I just wanted to make that distinction. So to qualify, we all don't need to do everything. However, the work that needs to be done is both about social consciousness and narrative, and as well as specific actions to decolonize our systems and our structures, and to ensure equity in all our structures and ensure a belonging. That's work across the board. And we need to support that in our language, in our thinking, and in how we show up, even if we're not actively in action in all of the spaces.
I was going to say, what have we missed? But I can't. We have to end on that note because that was so powerful. That was beautifully said. Well, okay. So is there anything, I mean, I want to end there, but I also want to make sure that you feel like we've had not a fulsome conversation, because we could talk for hours on these topics, but is there anything that we need to point out or bring into people's minds or attention that we haven't covered or didn't get a chance to talk about today?
Only that it's a lifelong journey. It's not a quick fix. I think both times we've talked about 400 years in the making plus, depending on what lens you're looking at this from.
Of course.
So there are no quick solutions, and there's no quick way to resolve all of the anxiety, stress, pressures that we're feeling. I firmly believe that every small action matters. We're at a tipping point. We are at a point in history that the future generations will look back at and say, my hope, my wish, my prayer is that they'll look back and say, okay, that generation did something right. And I also want to name that previous generations, these are complex issues, conscious, unconscious, um, in whatever ways we have arrived here, we don't have to be stuck here. We don't have to give up, or we don't have to say it's too overwhelming, and we don't have to um, try to fix everything that that has been calcified into the ways that they are right now. Sometimes we need to just let go of that and rebuild. What we need to be committed to is a future that's different, and that's not always about dismantling. I think what's present for me right now is I have been talking about we have to decolonize, we have to dismantle, but we have to build, because some issues we will take another 400 years just untangling. And is that
Right.
worth the creative energy, or will that just become destructive energy? Are there
It's a very
spaces and are there
powerful point.
issues and are there times that we just say, okay, that stops today and we're just going to build different? And for some things, yes, let's go back and look at the inequities and let's fix what we can. But it's a lifelong journey.
So educate ourselves without getting stuck in analysis paralysis, and then take action. Whatever that small step that you can
Whatever that is.
take, and it may be just watching or listening to the links that Yabome and I have collected and will have in the show notes here today as a really a very easy first step. And I think the other thing is to bring up the conversation with the people around you that are close to you, and be in conversation in these topics, because the more of us that are actively having these conversations out there in the world, the more likely that the message will continue to spread, and the better hope we have for action being taken collectively, even small actions, so that you know that people are trying and trying again, trying and doing.
Hold the faith that any and everything you do matters. Changes never happen by one big crescendo. It's always an accumulation of events, an accumulation of actions. So anything that you do to stay on a positive change trajectory on these issues matters.
My name is Mike Desjardins. This is Yabome Gilpin-Jackson. And this has been another in a series of conversations with leaders. Yabome, thank you so much for taking the time to have this conversation today. I look forward to our next chat.
Thank you.